My daughter and her husband packed up everything I owned into garbage bags while I was in the hospital, then changed the locks and told the neighbors I'd moved to assisted living. 4 weeks later, they were leaving 17 voicemails a day, driving to every address they could find, and showing up at my brother's house at 7 in the morning, begging him to tell them where I'd gone. They never found me, not until I wanted them to. I didn't know any of this was happening while I was lying in a bed at Mercy General with a broken hip and a lot of time to think. The fall had happened on a Tuesday, early October, the kind of crisp morning that makes you feel good about being alive. I'd been coming down the back porch steps with my coffee when my boot caught the edge of the rotted second step, the same step I'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. At 67 years old, your body doesn't negotiate with concrete. I heard the pop before I felt the pain. The ambulance came. Surgery happened. And then the slow grey drift of recovery, which is mostly just waiting and watching ceiling tiles and wondering whether you remembered to turn off the stove before you fell. My daughter came to see me that first evening. She sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed, her coat still on, her phone face up on her knee. She asked how I was feeling, and before I could really answer, she started talking about logistics, recovery timelines, whether Medicare would cover the full stay, whether I'd thought about my long-term living situation. I told her I'd be going home when they released me, to my house, the one I'd owned since 1991. She nodded in a way that didn't mean agreement, just acknowledgement that she'd heard the words. Her husband didn't visit at all that first week. He had work, she said. Very busy. I told her that was fine because honestly I didn't have much to say to him anyway. I'd never had much to say to him. He was the kind of man who filled a room with his presence while contributing nothing to it. Loud opinions about politics and sports and other people's decisions. Careful silence when it came to anything that actually required him to act. They'd been living with me for 2 years by then. That part matters. It matters because it explains everything that came after. It had started reasonably enough. My daughter's marketing job had been eliminated in a round of layoffs, and her husband's contracting business had gone quiet over the winter. They needed somewhere to land while they got back on their feet. I had a 4-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio, more space than one person needed, and the kind of stubbornness about helping family that Martha had always called my best and worst quality. She'd been gone 4 years by then. I missed having someone to call my qualities things. Just until we stabilize, my daughter had said on the phone. 6 months, maybe 8, we'll cover our own groceries and contribute to utilities. I told her family didn't need to make deals. I told her the house was big enough. I told her to come home. That was 2 years before the fall. The groceries they'd mentioned contributing to never happened. The utilities, I'd stopped expecting it after the third month. By the second year, they'd converted the master bedroom into their room, my room, because, as my daughter explained, it had the ensuite bathroom and her husband's back had been bothering him. I'd moved my things to the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall without making a scene about it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things. The house itself was in my name only. I'd bought it with Martha, paid it off by 2008, and her name had come off the deed when she passed. As far as the county recorder's office was concerned, the property at 2014 Widmore Drive belonged to one person, and that person was currently learning to use a walker in room 14B of Mercy General. I had a lot of time to think in that hospital room. By the second week, my daughter was bringing up rehabilitation facilities. There was one in Centerville, she said, that had excellent reviews, very clean, good staff ratios. I could stay there during my recovery, get the physical therapy I needed, and we could figure out the rest from there. The rest, I understood, meant me. I said I'd think about it. I didn't say what I was thinking about. What I was thinking about was a conversation I'd had with my brother-in-law, Gerald, Martha's younger brother, back in the spring. We'd had lunch at the diner on Salem Avenue, and he'd mentioned that his neighbor had gone through something similar. Son had moved in. Circumstances had changed, old man had ended up pushed out of his own home. Gerald had shaken his head over his coffee and said, "The thing people forget is that ownership is ownership. Doesn't matter who's living there." I'd nodded and eaten my pie and not thought much more about it. Lying in that hospital bed, I thought about it quite a lot. On the 16th day, I asked my daughter to bring me a specific folder from the filing cabinet in the second bedroom. The grey cabinet, third drawer, labeled Property. She brought it without opening it, which told me she either trusted me or had already looked and found nothing alarming. The folder held my original deed, mortgage pay of confirmation from 2008, property tax receipts going back 15 years, and a copy of my homeowner's insurance policy with my name on every line. I read through all of it twice, then I slid it under my mattress and asked the nurse for more pudding. The rehabilitation facility in Centerville was my daughter's idea, but I let her believe it was mine. I told her I'd been thinking about it, and she was right. It made sense to do the therapy properly before going home. She looked relieved in a way that should have hurt more than it did. I was getting better at noticing things clearly by then. What she didn't know was that I'd already made a phone call. Gerald had given me the name of an attorney, not because he predicted this moment, just because he was the kind of man who always knew someone useful in every professional category. The attorney was named Leonard Park, a property and estate lawyer in downtown Dayton who apparently specialized in, as Gerald put it, situations where family gets confused about what belongs to who. I called from the hospital room on a Thursday afternoon, my door closed, my voice low. Leonard Park was thorough and unhurried in the way of someone who'd heard every variation of every family story and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I explained the situation. He asked questions. By the end of the call, he'd confirmed what I'd already read in my folder. I was the sole legal owner of the property. My daughter and her husband were residents. They had no lease, no legal claim, no rights that superseded mine. "What are my options?" I asked. He told me. I listened carefully. The rehabilitation facility had decent coffee, which I hadn't expected, and a physical therapist named Marcus who was approximately 12 years old and entirely too cheerful about range of motion exercises, but who genuinely knew his business. I did my work. My hip complained constantly, but I'd spent 35 years as an electrician, which means I'd spent 35 years working through complaints from various parts of my body. You learn to negotiate. My daughter visited twice a week. She brought flowers the first time and the casserole the second time. She talked about the house in ways that told me she'd settled into it differently. She mentioned rearranging the living room furniture. She mentioned that her husband had finally fixed the back porch steps. I thanked her for telling me and said nothing about what I'd already started doing. What I'd started doing was this. I'd called Leonard Park back and authorized him to begin the paperwork to formally establish exclusive occupancy. I'd also called Sandra at Realty One. Not the same Sandra from the video, my own Sandra. Sandra Kowalczyk, who'd sold Martha and me the house in the first place and who'd sent me a Christmas card every year since. I asked her what 2004 Whitmore Drive would sell for in the current market. She called back the next morning with a number that made me sit very still for a moment. $380,000. The house Martha and I had bought for $86,000 in 1991, where we'd raised our daughter, where I'd finished paying the mortgage the year before the financial crisis, while everyone else was losing everything, where I'd lived alone and then not alone, and then effectively alone again even with two other people present. That house was worth $380,000. I told Sandra to hold that thought. I'd be in touch. The night before I was discharged from the rehab facility, I had one conversation that I'd been postponing. I called my daughter and told her I was coming home Friday morning, that I'd arranged a ride and that I needed her and her husband to be there when I arrived. Her voice sounded warm and relieved. "Of course, Dad, we'll be here. I made up your room." She meant the small bedroom at the end of the hall. I thanked her and hung up and looked out the window at the parking lot for a long time. The ride came from Gerald, who pulled up in his Buick at 9 sharp and didn't ask questions because I'd already told him most of it over the phone. He was 71 and had a face like a man who'd seen enough of life to find most things more interesting than shocking. We drove the 40 minutes mostly in comfortable quiet, the kind that only exists between people who've known each other for decades. When we pulled onto Whitmore Drive, I noticed the front yard first. They'd done something with the flower beds, dug out the rose bushes Martha had planted in 2003. The roses that had come back every spring for 21 years. In their place was a clean border of ornamental grass that looked like it belonged in front of a hotel. I sat with that for a moment before I got out of the car. My daughter met me at the door and her husband was standing a few feet behind her, with his hands in his pockets and a careful expression I'd learned to recognize as his version of performing normalcy. He shook my hand and said it was good to have me back. I thanked him. Inside, the living room furniture had been rearranged, and there was a large television mounted to the wall where Martha's painting had hung, the watercolor of the lake in Vermont from our 35th anniversary trip. I looked for the painting and didn't see it anywhere on the main floor. I asked where it was. My daughter said they'd moved it to storage because it didn't fit the new layout. She said it was completely safe. I said that was fine and asked to sit down, because my hip was still reminding me of its opinions about standing. We sat, the three of us, in the rearranged living room of my house, and I looked at my daughter and her husband and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than that. The recognition of a situation that had reached its natural end. I told them I'd been doing a lot of thinking during recovery. I told them I appreciated them keeping the house while I was away. I told them that the arrangement we'd had for the past 2 years clearly wasn't working for any of us, and that I'd made some decisions. My daughter leaned forward. What kind of decisions? I told her I'd spoken with an attorney. I told her I'd reviewed the property documentation. I told her that as the sole legal owner of the home, I was formally requesting that they make arrangements to find other housing, and that I was giving them 60 days, which was more than the 30 days required by Ohio law for someone in their residential status, because they were family and 60 days was reasonable. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the air pressure in a room. Her husband recovered first. His face went through several expressions before landing on something controlled and cold. "You're kicking us out." I told him that was one way to look at it. Another way was that I was exercising my rights as the owner of a property that they had been living in rent-free for 2 years, and that I was giving them a generous timeline to make other arrangements. My daughter's voice was very quiet. "Dad," I told her I loved her. I told her this wasn't about love. I told her it was about the fact that I'd come home from the hospital to find my wife's roses gone and my wife's painting in storage and my house rearranged by people who didn't own it, and that I was 67 years old and had exactly one home, and I intended to live in it the way I chose for whatever time I had left. Her husband said something about how they'd been caring for the property, maintaining it, making improvements. I mentioned the back porch steps, which he'd fixed, and thanked him for that. Then I mentioned the rose bushes and the painting and the master bedroom that used to be mine. And I said that what he was describing as improvements were things I hadn't been asked about. He said I was being unreasonable. I said I'd see them at dinner and went to rest my hip. The next 2 weeks were cold and uncomfortable in the way that only a house with people who are angry at you can be. My daughter barely spoke to me at meals. Her husband had taken to communicating to her, a logistical inconvenience that everyone pretended was not happening. I went about my business. I called Leonard Park to confirm the formal occupancy notice had been properly documented. I had lunch with Gerald twice. I started sleeping in the master bedroom again, which was technically only possible because they'd moved the guest room in a silent power struggle that I simply declined to engage with. I also called Sandra Kowalczyk, not to sell immediately. I wanted to understand the full picture. Sandra came by on a Wednesday while my daughter and her husband were both out, and she walked through the house with a professional eye, making notes, asking about the HVAC age and the roof condition, and whether the kitchen had been updated. She was kind about the ornamental grass that had replaced the rose bushes, which told me she was good at her job. You're the owner, you're the sole name on everything, and the market is favorable, she said at the kitchen table with her coffee. If you wanted to sell, you'd have offers within a week. I told her I was still thinking. Take your time, she said, but have a plan. People in your daughter's situation, living in a property they don't own, sometimes make things complicated when they realize they have no legal leverage. I thought about that after she left. I thought about the rose bushes and the painting and the 2 years of utility bills I'd paid alone. Then I thought about my daughter at 16 sitting at the same kitchen table doing her homework, asking me to quiz her on state capitals. Then I thought about how those two things could both be true at the same time and how that didn't change what needed to happen. The conversation that broke things open happened on a Sunday. I'd made breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, and brought a plate to the table like I used to when my daughter was young. She sat down. Her husband was still upstairs. She looked at the eggs and then at me, and her face crumpled a little in a way she immediately tried to control. She asked me if I was really going to make them leave. I said yes. She asked why. Not arguing, just asking. It was the first real question she'd asked me in 2 weeks. I told her the truth, which took longer than I expected. I told her about the morning I'd woken up in the small bedroom at the end of the hall and realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone in this house had asked how I was doing before they had a logistical reason to need something from me. I told her about the insurance conversation she'd asked about my life insurance policy 6 months ago, a casual question in the kitchen, and I'd noticed it but not said anything. I told her about coming home from the hospital to find Martha's painting gone and how that had felt like arriving at a house that had been converted into a place I was being warehoused until something more permanent could be arranged. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We never thought of it that way." I told her I believed her. I also told her that not meaning harm and not causing it were different things, and that 60 days was still 60 days. Her husband came downstairs in the middle of that sentence, heard the last part, and his expression went hard in a way I'd seen before. He said this was harassment. He said they had rights. He said they had rights. He said he was going to talk to a lawyer. I told him that was a good idea, and that the lawyer would explain the difference between a legal tenant and a person living informally in someone else's home, and that this information might be useful. He said some other things. I finished my eggs. They were gone in 41 days, not 60. I didn't ask where they went because that wasn't my business. My daughter came to say goodbye on a Thursday morning, just her, and we stood in the kitchen and she hugged me and I held on a little longer than I'd planned to. She said she was sorry about the roses. She meant it. I told her I knew she did. What happened after that moved quietly, the way things do when the crisis part is over. I hired a landscaper to come look at the front yard. He found the root systems from the roses were still there, dormant in the ground. He said with some care and the right timing, they'd likely come back. I told him to do what he could. I moved back into the master bedroom properly, my books on the nightstand, Martha's photograph on the dresser, the room feeling like itself again gradually. Gerald helped me get the painting out of the storage unit they'd rented. It was fine, wrapped carefully, which was one small glaze. I rehung it on the living room wall. The nail hole from the television mount is still there. I haven't decided yet whether to patch it or leave it as a reminder of what happens when you let things go too long without saying what needs to be said. The house is quiet now in a way that took some getting used to. Quiet is different when you've chosen it. You notice different things. The creak of the second step. Fixed now, solid, the way the afternoon light comes through the kitchen window and makes a stripe across the floor that Martha always called her sundial. The sound of the roses, which won't make any sound for months yet, but which are in the ground and which will come back, the landscaper says, stubborn and reliable as things that belong somewhere tend to be. My daughter calls on Sundays. The calls have gotten longer recently. She asks how I'm feeling before she asks anything else. I told her that matters to me. And she said she knows that now. And we're both learning to sit with the fact that sometimes you have to lose something before you understand what it was. I'm 67 years old. I own my house. I know where Martha's painting is. And I've learned that the most important things you have are rarely the ones other people remember to protect for you. You have to do that yourself, clearly and without apology, before it's too late to matter. There's something I keep coming back to when I think about that October. Not the hospital, not the hip, not even the locks. It's the roses. My wife planted those roses in 2003. She picked that spot herself, said the morning light hit it right. For 21 years, they came back every spring without anyone asking them to, without anyone reminding them what they were supposed to do. And then one afternoon, while I was lying in a hospital bed learning to walk again, someone decided they didn't fit the new layout and pulled them out. That's the thing about taking what isn't yours. You don't just take the object, you take the history attached to it. You take the mornings someone spent tending it. You take the quiet decisions that went into placing it exactly there and not somewhere else. My daughter and her husband didn't think they were erasing anything. They thought they were redecorating. That gap between what you intend and what you actually do. That's where most family damage lives. I don't tell the story because I came out ahead financially, though the property attorney made sure I understood exactly where I stood. I tell it because of what I had to learn about myself in that hospital room before any of the legal conversations happened. I had to admit that I'd spent 2 years watching things get taken from me gradually. My bedroom, my kitchen routines, my wife's painting, eventually my dignity in my own home. And I'd stayed quiet because I confused keeping the peace with keeping the family. Those aren't the same thing. I know that now in a way I didn't know it before the fall. What I had to find in myself wasn't anger. Anger I had plenty of. What I needed was clarity. The ability to look at a situation straight on without flinching away from what it actually was. My daughter and her husband had been living in my home rent-free for 2 years and had gradually come to treat my generosity as their entitlement. Understanding that clearly, without softening it out of loyalty or guilt, was the hardest and most necessary thing I did during those weeks. And then I had to act on what I understood. That part surprised me. It's one thing to see a situation correctly. It's another to pick up a phone, make a call, sit across from an attorney, and say out loud, "This is my property, and I'm reclaiming it." At 67, with a broken hip and the daughter who barely looked at me over dinner, doing that required something I can only describe as deciding that my own life was worth protecting. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. The roses came back, by the way. The landscaper said the root systems were still there, dormant underground, waiting. Turns out, you can remove what's visible and not touch what matters most if the thing was planted deep enough to begin with. I think about that more than I probably should. What gets planted deep enough to survive being pulled out? What we build in our lives that holds, even when someone decides it doesn't fit their new layout? The answer I found is usually the things we tended without expecting credit for it. The quiet work, the steady choices made year after year when no one was keeping score. My daughter calls on Sundays now. The calls are longer than they used to be. She asks how I'm feeling first. That's the part that matters to me, and she knows it. And we're both still learning what it means to start over with something that got damaged before either of us fully understood its value.